Good morning. Wow, my hair's crazy. I forgot to comb it. I feel like James, chapter 1, the man who looks in a mirror and then forgets what he looks like. So here we are, and we're at Leviticus chapter 15, and we're reading today Leviticus 15. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any man has a discharge from his body, he is unclean. This is an uncleanness of his discharge. Whether his body secretes the discharge or retains it, he is unclean. All the days that his body secretes or retains anything because of the discharge, he is unclean. Any bed the man with the discharge lies on will be unclean. Any furniture he sits on will be unclean. Anyone who touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Whoever sits on furniture that the man with the discharge was sitting on is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Whoever touches the body of a man with a discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spits on anyone who is clean, he is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any saddle the man with the discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. And whoever carries such things is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he'll remain unclean until evening. If the man with a discharge touches anything without first rinsing his hands in water, the person who is touched is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any clay pot that the man with the discharge touches must be broken, while any wooden utensil must be rinsed with water. When the man with the discharge has been cured of it, he is to count 7 days for his cleaning, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in fresh water. He will be clean. He must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons on the 8th day. Remember 8 days? 8th day means new beginning. Come before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them. One is a sin offering and the other is a burnt offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. When a man has an emission of semen, he is to bathe himself completely with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there is an emission of semen must be washed with water, and it will remain unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with a woman and has an emission of semen, both of them are to bathe with water, and they will remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge, and it consists of blood from her body, she will be unclean because of her menstruation for 7 days. Everyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her menstruation will become unclean, and anything she sits on will become unclean. Everyone who touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Everyone who touches any furniture she was sitting on is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If discharge is on the bed or in the furniture she was sitting on, when he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her and blood from her menstruation gets on him, he will be unclean for 7 days, and every bed he lies on will become unclean. When a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, though it is not the time of her menstruation, or if she has a discharge beyond her period, she will be unclean all the days of her unclean discharge, and as she is during the days of her menstruation. Any bed she lies on during the day of her discharge will be like her bed during menstrual impurity. Any furniture she sits on will be unclean, as in her menstrual period. Everyone who touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. When she is cured of her discharge, she is to count 7 days, and after that she will be clean. On the 8th day she must take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest is to sacrifice one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. In this way the priest will make atonement for her before the Lord because of her unclean discharge. You must keep the Israelites from their uncleanness, so they do not die by defiling my tabernacle that is among them. This is the law for someone with a discharge: a man who has an emission of semen becoming unclean by it, a woman who is in her menstrual period, anyone who has a discharge, whether male or female, and a man who sleeps with an unclean woman. Wow. Good morning. Good morning. Everyone thought, I know, I lost my brush again. That's crazy. Good morning, Bill and Brad, Deb, Stephanie, Rhonda. Good morning, Wendy. Good morning, Susan. So you never think you're going to read the scripture and talk about menstrual cycles and semen emissions. But here we are in chapter 15, and you have to think, whoa, what's the scripture trying to say? Well, first of all, let's talk about cleanliness. I think that's the first thing. And there's this phrase in English. It's what is it called? A maxim, and it goes like this. It says, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." And I think part of the way they got this is probably from reading this. And I'm thinking just right now about our own washing our hands for 20 seconds and how suddenly everyone's talking about washing their hands. It wasn't even recommended by the CDC until the late 1980s that washing your hands was important. And that goes back even further than that. Women were having babies way back. And when they had a child with a midwife, the mortality rate for those children was less than if the woman was giving birth with a doctor, because the doctor would go in, would be working with a patient that was some kind of disease or was dying or had died, and they wouldn't even wash their hands, go right from that patient right to the woman that's giving birth to a baby and bring the baby out without washing their hands in between. Oh my goodness, of course there's a higher mortality rate with those babies. And then of course about Florence Nightingale, who said we should wash the instruments between surgeries. That was never happened. People weren't washing their hands, they weren't washing the equipment. And so here we are in the scripture, 3,000, 4,000 years prior to Florence Nightingale or anyone else, or COVID-19, and telling us to wash our hands and saying, hey, there's things that just make you unclean, and stay clean. All right? So just a big picture here, right? I'm trying to go big picture here. It's important to stay clean. In this case, these are all things that were outside of normal. Remember we talked about clean and unclean? It doesn't necessarily mean sin, and even though you have to do a sin offering, right? And a restitution offering, it looks like that's what they said here. A sin offering and a burnt offering. That was just always, right? Because there was no long-term forgiveness of sin. There's no long-term consecration. It was always just staying on top of, it's always just being, you always had to bring the offering. But I think in this case, we always think about clean and unclean. Well, a menstrual cycle, semen emission, well, those things can happen. That's natural part of life. Having a discharge from a boil, or not a boil, but just something that you have in a discharge, that's natural part of life, but it's not the norm to perfection, right? So we always have to remember, when you see clean and unclean, we think, oh, why is God making a menstrual cycle a sin? Or why is God making this a sin? And it's not a sin. Don't think of it that way. Think of it as not part of the norm of every day. It happens. It may be natural, like a birth is natural, a period is natural, but it's not the ideal. And I guess that's kind of how you try to interpret this, the idea of clean and unclean. And the other idea I see here is that they were unable during this time. So why is this such a big deal? Because during this time, if they were unclean, they couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't offer their sacrifice. They were separated from God that day until evening came, until they were through with their menstrual period. And I think you guys thought the same thing I did. In Leviticus, you talked about that. It said in verse 25, when a woman has a discharge of her blood for many days, though it's not time for her menstruation, or if she's a discharge beyond her period, she'll be unclean all the days of her unclean discharge. And when I read that, bing, what'd you think of? I bet you thought the same thing I did in the Gospels. And my mind is just absolutely blank today. But I remember in the Gospels, there's this woman, and someone wants to look it up and tell me what the chapter is. A woman had an issue of blood. Do you remember that story? And the scripture says that it was almost for 12 years. And so that means for 12 years, she was unclean. For 12 years, no one could touch her. For 12 years, she could not have intimate relationship with any man, because no man would want to be with a woman that had an issue of blood, because it would make him unclean the entire time. So she was cut off from intimacy. She was cut off from basically society, because everything she touched also became unclean. And then she was also cut off from a relationship with God. Why? Because if she was unclean, she could not go to the temple. She could not have anyone bring her sacrifice. She could not bring her sacrifice. She was also unclean. And so she hears about Jesus, and she thinks Jesus can be the one to touch her. She thinks Jesus can be the one that can heal her. And so the scripture says that she reaches out while they are in a large crowd, and she touches the hem of his garment. And we have to understand what that means. And I don't know if it's going to come up in Leviticus or not, but probably the hem of his garment meant the talit, or the tzitzit at the bottom. So a tzitzit is like a prayer shawl. I have one upstairs. I'll bring one down for another time. And that she reached out and she touched the strings that are hanging on his garment, because in the Torah it's required that you wear a prayer shawl, or you cover your clothes with a string. And so they would have strings that would hang on their clothes, and she reached out and she touched the prayer shawl. She touched what was to remind the Jewish man of God's presence. And she touches that, and she's immediately healed. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And Peter's like, "How could you say who touched me? There people are surrounding you on all sides. You're asking me who touched me." And then he looked at her and he said, "Your faith has made you whole." Can you, beautiful, Mark. Thank you. Deb looked it up for me. Mark chapter 5. Mark is my least favorite gospel, but that's fine. I'm sure it's in Luke as well. I love Luke. Mark's the first written, the gospel is written first, right? And why I don't like it is because it's too quick, and it's written for the purpose of encouraging new believers at the time to show the doubt and the discouragement of the apostles. So they were saying, "Hey, here are the leaders, and they struggled too, so you can struggle when you're a new believer." So I get all that, but I like Luke much better. So here it is in Mark chapter 5. Thank you, Deb Bankston, for finding it. And having heard about Jesus, verse 27, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his robe. Let's just say, you want to cross it out. We know it's probably robe, but we know. I'm almost like 100% sure she touched his tzitzit. And for she said, "If I can touch his robes, I'll be made well." Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was cured of her affliction. And once Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him, he turned around the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" So he was looking around to see who had done this. Then the woman, knowing that what had happened to her, came with trembling and fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be free from your affliction." Wow. I mean, that's so cool. Like, it's so cool in so many ways. So when we read Leviticus helps us understand Mark chapter 5. Why? Because we didn't realize, we think, "Oh, that's so sad that she had this issue of blood." But that issue of blood meant that she was cut off from intimacy, cut off from society, and cut off from worshiping the one true God at the temple. And now when we read that, we're like, "Oh, okay, that's significant." That's why Leviticus is significant for us. And I think just because I'm reading in Mark, I want to say this for a moment. Peter said to them, he said to his disciples, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" Just because we're near, and just because we're pressed against, like in this case, right? Pressed against Jesus, but only one had his power. I could be that close to Jesus. I could be that close to whatever, the scripture or ministry or whatever it is, but not have his power. It was the woman who had faith to touch the hem of his garment. Everyone is touched. There's tons of people touching him, but only one received his power to heal her. Why? Because she had the faith necessary. So I just want to encourage you. Thank God for Leviticus that helps us understand not only just cleanliness that we should be practicing, but also this idea for this woman who had been unclean for those years, and God, because she believed and touched him, she was willing to believe that God healed her. And so today I'll ask you to press forward and press close to him, and have faith to believe that he has the power to heal and save and deliver for whatever your needs are. God bless you. Have a great Monday, Easter Monday. Bye-bye.